Elbridge Colby. Elbridge Colby is the co-founder and principal of the Marathon Initiative, a policy initiative focused on developing strategies to prepare the United States for an era of sustained great power competition. He's the author of Strategy of Denial, American Defense in an Age of Great Power Conflict. Be sure to follow him at Twitter at Elbridge Colby. And, of course, we'll have that information in the sidebar at Ricochet.com. Welcome to the podcast.
Great to be with you, gentlemen.
Well, before you got here, we briefly discussed the State of the Union because we were just all rapt and fascinated by every syllable. You mentioned how there's, the China thing didn't seem to play, what is the China problem? What is the administration's China strategy? It doesn't really seem like we know what we're doing. Or do we? Give us a 1 to 10 evaluation of how you think the administration is handling China. And also, whether or not China is the sort of strong strider of the globe that it seems to be today, or is challenged by many internal problems, primarily demographic.
Let me break that apart. The first thing I want to say is the right way to measure how we or the administration is doing is not relative to how administrations of the past did it, although they may deserve credit on that front, but relative to the threat. And this is really critical because a lot of our foreign policy debate is self-referential and kind of, if you will, solipsistic. And in that context, I want to quote something from a really authoritative source, which is to say Top Gun, which is, there are no points for second place, right? So actually, in fairness, I have to give the administration pretty good marks on a lot of things. I have to give them good marks on the sanctions, on the semiconductors, on the posture announcements that have been rolled out with the Japanese and the Filipinos, the Australians and others over the last year or so. And there are other things that they're doing. Their national defense strategy, like ours in the Trump administration, is focused on China. They're overhauling, the military leadership overhauling, particularly the Marine Corps and the Air Force, et cetera. I could go on. That's all the good part, and that actually compares favorably to some of the previous administration, including elements of the one in which I'm proud to have served.
I want to stop. I want to stop you right there because you mentioned something about the semiconductors. Did we not decapitate essentially a lot of their AI research, a lot of their semiconductor inventing possibilities with a series of requests and requirements that we made about people as regards to their citizenship? We just made a whole bunch of people who work there come home and take them away from China.
I don't think we decapitated them. I think Neil Ferguson has a very good point that there's a 1941 dynamic here that we are risk, and this gets to the point I was about to make, that we risk provoking China precisely when we're weak. The last point I'd like to say, just on the earlier point, is that we are not doing enough relative to the scale of the threat, and that gets to your third point, which is it's possible that the Peter Zeihan's or the Hal Brands and Michael Beckleys are right that China's on the verge of collapse. I don't think that's a prudent strategic assessment because we should prepare for the downside because the consequences of being wrong on that would be catastrophic if we're wrong. Personally, I'm also somewhat skeptical, but that almost doesn't matter. And to your point about the semiconductors, I'm trying to get a good sense of that. Some people say it's quite significant. I was talking to a very well-informed person yesterday who was saying this is going to hold them back for maybe a couple of years in certain areas. So that it actually might not, and that actually is in some ways could be even relieving because it actually relieves the Neil Ferguson concern. So I think the way to look at what the administration is doing, frankly, is that they are doing a number of good things within the construct that we have been pursuing, which is the walk and chew gum construct. But that is woefully inadequate for the scale of the threat.
So what is the scale of the threat? What's the best analogy? You mentioned Neil Ferguson. He talks about Cold War II. Is he right? Is this Europe in the 1930s? Is this Napoleon? What's the best analogy?
Probably the best analogy would be Great Britain and Imperial Germany, just in terms of scale and the nature of the kind of government that we're dealing with. But I think Neil is basically right. I mean, there was an embarrassing, I think, self-discrediting error made by Robert Kagan in his massive piece in the Wall Street Journal last weekend, in which he contended that China was less powerful relative to the U.S. economy than the Axis powers were, which is just totally incorrect. The Chinese economy, in market exchange terms, is probably something on the order of 3/4 of the size of the American economy, but that's probably artificially inflated by the dollar and the role of services in the American economy. But in purchasing power parity terms, the Chinese economy is potentially larger. Kagan then, I think, made the situation worse by claiming that the Soviet Union, if you added it to the Axis powers, was larger than the United States, except that proves my point because the United States allied with the Soviet Union. So, I mean, actually, there is no historical analogy This is the first time that we have faced, as an international power, as a developed power on the world stage, an economy that is even remotely comparable, let alone potentially larger than our own.
Are you worried that this war will be less cold and more hot? Are you worried about an invasion of Taiwan? Do you think we're doing enough to forestall that? What sort of time frame do you imagine this will take place in?
I'm very worried. I think there's a very good chance that there could be a hot war. I don't make predictions. I don't know what's in Xi Jinping's head. I don't know the future, et cetera, et cetera. But I look at the factors, and I think there is a very real set of incentives for the Chinese to act militarily, partially because, as we can see with the Russians, economic sanctions don't actually really work. So the Chinese are not going to gain regional hegemony and global preeminence through economic sanctions alone. It's basically, to be very simple about it, it's basically the use of direct military force. And there are reasons to think that they could succeed. And I was very put off by a very sanguine assessment from the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Colin Call, yesterday on the internet or whatever, that was dismissive of these. General Minahan, the Air Mobility Commander, said, predicted it's in 2025. I think those two extremes are wrong. The correct one is what General Berger, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, says. We don't know, but we have to be as ready as possible, precisely in order to deter it. I agree with Assistant Secretary of Defense Eli Ratner, who said yesterday, it's not inevitable. We can get through this decade. I disagree with Graham Allison's The World, and this is where I disagree with Neil, that it's not futile. We can do it, but we have to laser focus. And to answer your question, we are not doing enough, because what is enough? Nobody knows. But why even get close? And that's where, and we are cutting it very close. I mean, I'm not in favor of really increasing the defense budget, but we should either be increasing the defense budget or cutting a lot of stuff in the military to focus on China, but we're not doing that. Meantime, we're supporting a proxy war in the Ukraine. And that's not a comment about the justness of the Ukrainians' cause. They are in a just cause. But the purpose of American foreign policy is not missionary work, as Kissinger said. It's to advance and protect the interests of the American people.
So it's impossible, though, for me, although I agree with you that this is new and something entirely different. It's impossible for me not to apply the Soviet Union Cold War model to this, right? It's just, my brain doesn't work any other way. So I've got this example, and I know it's imperfect, but I'm still going to use it. It seemed like that was the training wheels Tinker Toy version of this, because we were not enmeshed economically, the Soviet Union at all, really. Every now and then we sent them wheat. That's about all we did. And we used that wheat as lever to get concessions, usually social concessions, a lot of times, letting Soviet Jews leave Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. So the question is, as we disentangle our economies with the Chinese, which we're kind of doing, or at least gesturing to, with these sort of semiconductor niches, et cetera, their response is going to be to one of two things, right? One is, let's wait and build up our own, and that delays, our regional ambitions for X number of years as we, develop that. Or it could be, let's strike now. Let's do this before the Americans inoculate their tech industry and their manufacturing industry and all the things that they need to, we need to disentangle from China in order to do that, in order to have a nice, clean playing field on which to sort of protect Taiwan or whatever we want to do. So which is it? Is it, when we buy time, are we buying time for them, or are we buying time for us?
Well, that's a great question, and that's one that people are thinking about on both sides of the Pacific a great deal. What I would say is that's one of the reasons why the Cold War analogy is imperfect. My partner and great friend Wes Mitchell wrote a very good piece in the Wall Street Journal last year, kind of rebutting a sort of, I would say, a linear application of the Cold War analogy. Obviously, there's a lot of, the Cold War is an example of a strategic competition, which is common in history. So it's likely to be consistent. I'm a realist. I look at history. It's likely to be consistent with that. I actually think the economic stuff is dramatically overstated in its importance in the public debate, and the military balance is understated. And this gets at my basic view, which is that countries are unlikely to concede to Chinese hegemony through the application of economic leverage. And we've seen that already. Now, the Chinese are preparing in things like dual circulation for the imposition of American sanctions. Ask yourself why they would do that. And also to generate leverage on the United States. Now, that can work on the margin, but our experience of economic sanctions, including against the Russians right now, is they don't work very well. They can erode capability on the margin, like missile production and so forth, but they don't generally get at bringing countries to their knees. We've tried this repeatedly over the last 100 years, and it's been a record of woeful lack of success. is the
So what are
military
the
balance
perfect-
is what's
yeah.
important.
Okay, so that does remind me and does seem to sort of tickle my Reagan Cold Warrior
Mhm.
memories, right?
Okay.
Because he absolutely did make a commitment to rebuilding the military, to being
Yep.
sort of bellicose towards the Soviet Union, to being extremely, evil empire, et cetera,
Right.
being extremely,
Rhetorically.
but at least there were 4 years of aggressive action. We put MX missiles into
Mhm.
Germany, right? Or whatever
Pershing,
we put,
right.
we did.
We also
armed,
deployed MX missiles, but at home.
Yeah, exactly right.
Right.
So
Not-
we did that. And exactly. I'm sorry. That's right. I got my missiles mixed up.
Peacekeeper. That was.
But
the
we
name
did all
came
that.
up. It's much more pleasant.
Oh, that's right. That's right. Exactly right. That's right. But it turned out it was a cynical name, and people
Yeah,
interpreted it cynically. But it turned out it did the job, right?
Well, I
So-
would. Yeah. I mean, sorry. Good.
I would just say, isn't that an
Yeah,
example?
that's great. Well, I
you
mean,
make
I
a
want
commitment
to
to,
reclaim Reagan from the neo-Reaganites, the Bob Kagans and the Bill Kristols, because I think they play up a kind of Reagan as if he was George W. Bush in 2005 and saying we're going to end tyranny in the world and we're going to use our military everywhere. If you look at the Reagan record and you step back and you look at it over the scope, we had withdrawn from Indochina before him, and it is somewhat initiated under the Carter administration, but Reagan accelerated genuinely peace through strength, right? Which was major buildup of American military forces, pressure on the Soviet Union, working with our allies, including ones that we might not, that Carter didn't like to work with, like the Saudis or the Filipinos or the Philippines or some of the South American countries, et cetera, and then press it hard. I mean, very hot rhetorical temperature, but almost never employed the military. Grenada and Lebanon, which, Grenada was almost like
Sort
a
of
learning
kabuki.
experience. Yeah. So
and Lebanon was a disaster.
And then transition. It actually is what my view is we need to be hawks to get to be doves. Like Reagan probably was able to do it in his own administration. I think that's how we should look at it over time. I want to get to détente, but we have to be hawkish together.